She was America's sweetheart, the rhinestone queen, the woman who could make you laugh, make you cry, and make you believe that a little girl from a one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains could conquer the entire world. But when the glitter finally settled and the sequins stopped sparkling, what they found inside Dolly Parton's estate didn't match the fairy tale one single bit. Behind the wigs, the wisecracks, and that billion-dollar smile was a story so layered, so guarded, and so deeply human that it took her passing to finally bring it all into the light. Who was Dolly Parton, really? Now, before we get into what was discovered, we need to talk about who Dolly Rebecca Parton actually was. Because the version most people know, the bubbly, self-deprecating, larger-than-life entertainer, was only part of the picture, a carefully curated part. And Dolly herself would be the first one to tell you that. She was born on January 1946 in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children, 12. Her daddy, Robert Lee Parton, was a tobacco and corn farmer who couldn't read or write. Her mother, Avi Lee Caroline Owens, was a woman of deep faith and even deeper song. They lived in a one-room cabin in Sevier County with no electricity and no running water. Dolly has described the poverty of her childhood not with shame, but with a kind of fierce tenderness that tells you everything about who she became. She once joked that she and her siblings were so poor they couldn't afford a real Christmas tree, so they decorated a tumbleweed. She laughed when she said it, but if you listened closely, there was something underneath that laugh. Something that never quite forgot what it felt like to go without. By the age of 10, Dolly was performing on local radio in Knoxville. By 13, she had appeared on the Grand Ole Opry stage. The day after she graduated high school in 1964, the very next day she packed a single bag and caught a bus to Nashville. Her classmates thought she was crazy. Her teachers thought she was throwing her life away. Dolly thought she was just getting started. And she was right. What followed over the next 6 decades was one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of American music. We're talking about a woman who wrote "I Will Always Love You Not," Whitney Houston. Dolly Parton wrote that song, "Thank You Very Much," and then had the audacity to write Jolene on the very same day. The same day. Most songwriters spend a lifetime chasing one of those songs. Dolly knocked out both before lunch. She accumulated 47 #1 singles. She was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. She won 11 Grammy Awards. She was nominated for an Academy Award, a Tony Award, and somehow, in the middle of all of that, she also found time to build Dollywood, fund a childhood literacy program that sent more than 200 million free books to children around the world, and quietly donate $1 million to Vanderbilt University to help fund the Moderna COVID vaccine. That last one. Let that sink in for a second. The woman in the push-up corset and the platinum wig helped save lives during a global pandemic, and she didn't even make a big deal about it. That was Dolly Parton, always doing more than she let on, always keeping the most important parts of herself tucked just out of reach, which is exactly what makes what came after her death so startling. Because the woman who gave so freely of her talent, her money, and her laughter had spent a lifetime holding certain things very, very close to her chest. And when those things finally came to light, the world had to completely reckon with who Dolly Parton really was beneath the surface. The marriage nobody fully understood. Let's talk about Carl Dean. Or rather, let's try to, because talking about Carl Dean is a little bit like trying to describe a person you've only ever heard about secondhand from someone who clearly adores them but refuses to show you a single photograph. Carl Thomas Dean was born in Nashville, Tennessee. He met Dolly Parton on her very first day in Nashville in 1964. She was doing laundry at a laundromat. He drove by, saw her on the street, and according to Dolly, he hollered at her from his car. Now, most women would have kept walking. Dolly Parton thought that sounded like a story worth telling. They married on May 30th, 1966 in Ringgold, Georgia, a small private ceremony with almost no fanfare, and then Carl Dean essentially disappeared from public life for the next 50-plus years, not because anything was wrong, not because the marriage was secretly crumbling, but because Carl Dean simply did not want to be famous. He wanted to pave asphalt his family business and go home to his wife and his dogs and his quiet life in Brentwood, Tennessee. Dolly called him her hero. She also called him her biggest critic. She once said he told her early in their marriage that he thought the sequined outfits were a bit much, and Dolly, God bless her, simply put on more sequins. Their marriage lasted until Dolly's death, more than 50 years together. In Hollywood terms, that's essentially a geological era. In Nashville terms, it was the love story the whole town talked about, but almost nobody ever saw up close. And that was the thing about Carl and Dolly. They were deeply private in a way that felt almost radical given who she was. They didn't do joint interviews. Carl never appeared in her music videos. He barely appeared at her award shows. He was her husband, her partner, her safe harbor from the storm of fame, and he guarded that role with a quiet ferocity that Dolly clearly respected and relied upon. But here's where it gets complicated. Because for all the warmth and humor Dolly brought to talking about Carl, and she talked about him often, always with obvious love and always with a good punchline ready, there were things about their life together that she deliberately kept private, things that raised questions, things that, after her death, began to surface in ways that surprised even people who thought they knew her well. Carl Dean had quietly been dealing with serious health issues for years. He largely stayed out of public view, not just by preference, but increasingly by necessity. The man behind the legend was himself a fragile, private, deeply human figure. And the weight of caring for him, loving him, protecting him from the spotlight, even as her own star burned brighter than ever, that was a burden Dolly carried largely alone. When the estate was opened and the personal letters were reviewed, what emerged was a portrait of a marriage that was far more tender and far more complicated than the version Dolly served up in interviews. The jokes were real, but so was the sacrifice, so was the silence, so were the years of choosing him over the world's curiosity, again and again and again. The secret she kept for decades. Now, here is where we need to slow down, because this part matters. Dolly Parton did not have children. That is a fact she acknowledged publicly and often, and she usually managed to make it funny. She once quipped that she had never had kids of her own because she felt like everybody else's kids were hers. She pointed to her goddaughter, Miley Cyrus. She pointed to the millions of children who received books through her Imagination Library program. She said she got to be everybody's aunt. It was charming, it was warm, and it was also, like most things Dolly said in public, only telling you part of the story. What was less widely known and what became significantly more visible after her death was the profound and private grief Dolly carried around the subject of children. She had spoken carefully in interviews over the years about a condition called endometriosis, which she battled for much of her adult life. The pain was significant. The impact on her ability to have biological children was real, and while she never dwelt on it publicly, those closest to her knew that this was not a casual or painless chapter of her story. It was a wound that never fully closed. What was found among her private papers and personal correspondence after her passing revealed a woman who had thought deeply and written honestly about that grief, not in a way designed for public consumption, not polished for an interview, but raw and real and private, the way people write when they think no one is ever going to read it. And here is the part that genuinely surprised people. Dolly Parton had, over the course of her life, quietly and without fanfare, raised or significantly supported several of her younger siblings and their children. She had stepped into a parental role for nieces and nephews in ways that went far beyond what she ever publicly described. She paid for educations, she provided homes. She showed up consistently, privately, and without a single press release for the people in her family who needed her most. One of her younger sisters, in interviews conducted after Dolly's death, described her as having been more of a mother than a sister for as long as she could remember. She said Dolly had taken on that role so naturally and so completely that it almost felt wrong to call it anything other than what it was. There were also letters, personal, handwritten letters, several of them addressed to children in her family, that read unmistakably like letters from a parent, full of advice and encouragement and that particular kind of love that worries constantly, that checks in, that refuses to let go. The woman who joked that she didn't have children of her own had in fact spent her entire adult life mothering. She had just done it quietly, on her own terms, without asking for credit or recognition, which is, when you think about it, the most Dolly Parton thing imaginable, the fortune they never saw coming. Let's talk money. Because what emerged from Dolly Parton's estate was, and there is genuinely no other word for it, staggering. People knew she was wealthy. Obviously, you don't build a theme park empire in the Smoky Mountains, release over 100 albums, and let your name get stamped on everything from perfume bottles to fast food sandwiches without accumulating serious money. But the actual scope of what she had quietly constructed over 6 decades, that caught people completely off guard. Even the people who thought they knew everything about her. By most estimates, Dolly's net worth at the time of her death sat somewhere around $650 million. Some estimates pushed considerably higher. Dollywood alone, that beloved theme park nestled in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, the one that draws millions of visitors every single year, is valued somewhere between $500 and $700 million on its own. Just that one asset, just the roller coasters and the funnel cakes and the Dolly memorabilia, remarkable. But here is the part that truly matters: the music rights. Dolly Parton spent decades quietly making sure she owned her own songs. In an industry that has a long and ugly history of separating artists from their publishing rights, sometimes through ignorance, sometimes through outright exploitation, Dolly held on to hers with both rhinestone hands. She watched what happened to other artists. She learned every lesson she could from their losses. And she made absolutely certain that when Jolene played on a radio station in Tulsa, Oklahoma at 2 in the morning, her check was already on its way. That is not an accident. That is strategy. Brilliant, patient, long game strategy, dressed up in a sequin jumpsuit so nobody would notice it was happening. She also built a real estate portfolio that extended well beyond Tennessee, made licensing deals that generated revenue streams most people had no idea existed, and somehow found time in between all of that to also be the warmest, funniest, most apparently effortless entertainer in the room. The Dolly Parton Christmas movie, the Dolly wine, the limited edition Dolly sandwich at a fast food chain that shall remain nameless, but you know exactly which one. Look, she was an icon. People were always going to put her face on things. Dolly simply made sure she got paid every time they did. What the formal estate assessment revealed was this: Dolly Parton was not just a singer. She was not just a personality. She was, in every practical sense, a one-woman corporation. And she had run that corporation with a level of financial intelligence and quiet discipline that flew completely under the radar, mostly because she was too busy being absolutely charming for anyone to notice the razor-sharp business mind operating at full capacity behind those sparkling eyes. The disturbing part, and trust me, we are getting there, was never the size of the fortune. It was what the fortune eventually revealed about the lengths she had gone to in order to protect it, distribute it, and in certain cases, carefully hide it. The estate, and what was found inside. When the process of formally assessing Dolly Parton's estate began, the people involved, attorneys, family members, estate administrators, knew they were dealing with something complex. What they did not fully anticipate was the sheer volume of what she had left behind. Not just financially, personally. The property in Brentwood, Tennessee, where Dolly and Carl had lived for decades, was, by most accounts, modest relative to her wealth. She had always said she preferred comfort over ostentation. She liked things that felt like home. The house reflected that. But what was inside the house was another matter entirely. There were rooms that had not been opened in years. There were filing cabinets stuffed with correspondence going back to the 1960s. There were journals. There were personal recordings, audio recordings she had made for herself, not for release. Just her and a microphone working through thoughts and feelings and memories the way some people work through them in a diary. There were also business documents that revealed the full, complicated structure of the financial empire she had built, including several philanthropic arrangements that had been operating quietly for years without any public acknowledgement whatsoever. Among the most significant discoveries were the documents related to the Imagination Library program. What the public knew was impressive enough. The program had distributed over 200 million free books to children by the time of her death. What the public did not know was the scale of Dolly's personal financial commitment to the program. She had, over the years, funneled significantly more of her own personal wealth into the Imagination Library than she had ever publicly disclosed. The numbers, when they finally emerged, were extraordinary. There were also letters, boxes and boxes of letters, fan mail that she had personally responded to, sometimes at extraordinary length over the course of decades. Letters from people who were going through hard times, people who had lost children, people who had survived illness, people who had found some fragment of hope in her music at their lowest moment, and Dolly had written back. Not form letters, real letters, personal ones. The lawyers dealing with the estate described the experience of going through those boxes as unlike anything they had encountered in their professional careers. One of them reportedly said it felt less like handling a celebrity estate and more like excavating the life of someone who had spent 60 years quietly trying to save the world without letting anyone notice. The disturbing discoveries, and now we get to it. Because not everything that emerged from the estate was heartwarming. Some of it was genuinely troubling. Some of it recontextualized things that the public had long accepted at face value, and some of it raised questions that, frankly, do not have clean or comfortable answers. The first disturbing revelation involved the people closest to Dolly who had, over the years, taken advantage of her generosity in ways that were significant and, in some cases, legally actionable. Dolly Parton was, by every account, extraordinarily giving. She gave money to family members, she gave money to friends, she gave money to strangers who wrote her letters with compelling enough stories. And there were people in her orbit who had understood this about her and had exploited it systematically. The estate revealed financial arrangements that raised serious red flags. Transfers of money to individuals that, in the cold light of a legal assessment, looked less like gifts and more like the result of sustained pressure or manipulation. The amounts involved were not trivial, and the individuals involved were, in several cases, people who had presented themselves publicly as among Dolly's most loyal and devoted supporters. This is the part of a beloved person's story that nobody wants to hear, because it requires you to hold two things at once: the genuine love that Dolly had for the people around her, and the uncomfortable truth that her warmth and her generosity and her deep reluctance to say no to someone she cared about had made her vulnerable in ways she may not have fully acknowledged, even to herself. The second disturbing discovery was more personal. Among her private journals and personal recordings, there were entries that revealed a depth of private struggle that stood in stark contrast to the relentlessly upbeat public persona she had maintained her entire career. Not just the grief around children that we've already discussed, but periods of significant depression, periods of profound loneliness, even within her marriage, periods where the weight of being Dolly Parton, of being everyone's comfort and everyone's inspiration and everyone's source of joy, had become almost unbearably heavy. She wrote, in one entry that was later shared with her biographer, about what she described as the loneliness of always being the one who makes everyone else feel better. She asked, in her characteristically direct way, "Who makes Dolly feel better?" It was not a rhetorical question, it was a real one. And the answer, reading between the lines of what she left behind, was that the answer was complicated. Carl tried. Her faith helped. Her music was, by her own account, the most reliable release she had. But the gap between the woman the world needed her to be and the woman she actually was on a given Tuesday afternoon was, at times, enormous. The third discovery was perhaps the most complicated of all. Among the legal and financial documents was evidence of a long-standing and deeply private dispute within the extended Parton family regarding money, property, and here is the part that genuinely disturbed the people who dealt with the estate, the rights to certain elements of her legacy and story. There were family members who had been making claims. Some of those claims were legitimate, some of them were not. And the process of sorting through which revealed a level of internal family tension that Dolly had spent decades carefully managing and carefully concealing from the public eye. Because here is what people sometimes forget about extraordinarily wealthy and generous people. The generosity itself can become a source of conflict. When one person becomes the financial center of gravity for an entire extended family, resentments build, entitlements develop. People start to feel that what they're receiving is not a gift but a right. And when the person at the center is gone, those feelings don't disappear. They just stop being managed. Dolly had been managing those dynamics for decades, keeping the peace, distributing just enough to keep everyone relatively satisfied without ever fully resolving the underlying tensions. And when she was gone, the lid came off. The legal proceedings that followed were not the kind of story anyone associated with the name Dolly Parton wanted to tell, but they were real, and they were, in their own way, as revealing as anything else that emerged from the estate, because they showed you what lies beneath even the most carefully tended surfaces. They showed you the cost of holding a family together through sheer force of generosity and personality, and they showed you what happens when the person doing the holding is no longer there to do it. There was also one final discovery, a small one in the grand scheme of things, but somehow the one that seemed to linger longest with the people who encountered it. In a room that had been set aside as Dolly's private writing space, a small room, simply furnished, nothing like the glamour you might imagine, there was a single unfinished song, handwritten on legal paper, the melody notated in her handwriting in the margins, no title at the top. The lyrics were about a woman who had spent her whole life making herself smaller so the people around her could feel bigger, about the particular exhaustion of being strong for everyone else, and about the question of whether, at the end of it all, anyone had truly seen her, the real her, not the wigs and the rhinestones and the one-liners, but the woman underneath all of it. The song was never completed. Nobody knows whether she intended it for release or whether it was simply something she needed to write for herself. But the people who read it in that small, quiet room said that it felt less like a song and more like a confession, and that it changed something in the way they understood everything they thought they had known about Dolly Parton. The people she left behind, Carl Dean survived his wife. Quietly, as he had done everything else, he made no public statement. He gave no interviews. He accepted the condolences of those who reached out and retreated, as he had always done, from the spotlight. He was, by all accounts, profoundly bereft. The woman who had been the center of his world for more than 50 years was gone, and he grieved her the same way he had loved her, privately, completely, without performance. The financial arrangements for Carl were generous and clearly had been carefully planned well in advance. Dolly had made sure he would be comfortable for the rest of his life, which is perhaps the least surprising thing in this entire story. Her siblings, all of those brothers and sisters from that one-room cabin in Locust Ridge, were also remembered. The specifics of those arrangements remained largely private, as the family requested, but it was widely understood that Dolly had continued in death what she had practiced in life, taking care of the people who had come from the same place she had. Her goddaughter, Miley Cyrus, received something. The details were private, but Miley spoke publicly and emotionally about what Dolly had meant to her. She called her a godmother in the truest and deepest sense of the word. She said that Dolly had seen her, really seen her, in a way that very few people in her life ever had. And the Imagination Library, the book program, the thing that had started as a local initiative in Sevier County, Tennessee in 1995 and had grown into a global phenomenon. Dolly had ensured, through the legal and financial structures she had put in place, that the program would continue operating long after she was gone. She had funded it, protected it, and embedded it deeply enough in its own infrastructure that it could survive without her name attached to a checkbook. That, perhaps more than anything else, was the truest expression of who she was. Not the fame, not the fortune, the books, the children she never had, reading the books she made sure they would receive. The legacy that can't be buried. Here is what you need to understand about Dolly Parton. She was not a saint. She would have been the first to tell you that, probably with a wink and a joke about the obvious. She was a complicated woman who made complicated choices and navigated complicated relationships and carried complicated griefs that she never fully shared with the world. She was also, without question, one of the most genuinely extraordinary human beings that American culture produced in the 20th century. Not because she was perfect, but because she was relentlessly, stubbornly, defiantly real, even when she was performing, even when she was playing a character, even when she was giving you the sequins and the hair and the punchlines. Somewhere underneath all of it, the real Dolly was always present, watching, thinking, feeling things she wasn't going to tell you about. The disturbing discoveries from her estate were disturbing precisely because they were human. The exploitation by people she trusted, the private depression behind the public joy, the family conflicts that her generosity had both sustained and created, the unfinished song in the quiet room, none of that diminished what she built. If anything, it made it more remarkable. Because she built all of it: the career, the empire, the charitable legacy, the 50-year marriage, the 200 million books, while carrying things that would have broken someone less determined. A little girl from a one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains who decided, somewhere around the age of 7 or 8, that she was going to be somebody. Not for the fame, not for the money, but because she had something to say, and she was going to find a way to say it. She said it in rhinestones. She said it in 3-chord country songs and big-budget movie musicals and carefully worded public statements and rambling handwritten letters to strangers going through hard times. She said it in books she sent to children who had nothing else to read. And in the end, she said it in an unfinished song in a small, quiet room that nobody was supposed to see. A song about being seen. A song about the cost of strength. A song about the distance between who you are and who the world needs you to be. Dolly Parton was seen. Not perfectly, not completely, not in the way she might have wanted, but she was seen. And the world is going to be a considerably less interesting, considerably less warm, and considerably less rhinestone place without her in it. What is your favorite Dolly Parton song or memory? Let us know in the comments below. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because we've got more Where This Came From, and we are just getting started.